When I try to understand how it all began, I never arrive at a single moment. There was no dramatic discovery, no locked door, no secret box under the bed that changed my life in an instant. What I remember instead is pressure. Pressure in the walls of the house I grew up in. Pressure in the way my father cleared his throat when I cried too openly. Pressure in the way the men in my family spoke as if kindness were something you gave to others but never to yourself. I was a sensitive child in a practical home. We were not unloving people, but love often came wearing work boots. If someone was tired, they kept going. If someone was upset, they got quiet. If someone felt too much, they learned to make those feelings smaller so they would fit inside daily life without causing trouble. That was the first lesson I ever learned about survival. Become manageable. I became very good at that. I learned how to sit still at the dinner table even when my thoughts ran wild. I learned how to lower my voice, how to laugh at jokes that made me feel absent from myself, how to perform boyhood in a way that kept everyone comfortable. I watched other boys move through the world with an ease I could not imitate. Their bodies seemed to belong to them. Mine felt like a rented room I was expected to maintain but never decorate. And yet, even in those early years, I noticed that relief came to me through softness. Softness in the clean towels my mother folded with precise corners. Softness in the careful way my grandmother brushed powder across her wrists before church. Softness in the scent of cold cream, the hush of stockings being smoothed over the leg, the private dignity of a woman sitting at a mirror and taking time to become herself. I did not yet think of these things as feminine in any grand symbolic way. I thought of them as peaceful. I thought of them as ordered. I thought, with the desperate intelligence of a lonely child, that anything so gentle must know something about living that I did not. Loneliness makes a careful student. By the time I was 12, I had already begun collecting behaviors before I ever collected clothing. That is the part many people never understand. They assume transformation begins with a dress, a pair of heels, a lipstick tube hidden in the back of a drawer. For me, it began with paying attention. I noticed how women in my family touched objects without fighting them. I noticed the way they made a room feel inhabited rather than occupied. I noticed how care lived in repetition. Brushing hair, washing a face, applying lotion to dry hands, straightening a hem, choosing a necklace not for spectacle but for balance. I began imitating that care in private, long before I could explain why. When I was alone, I would wash my hands more slowly than necessary and study the movements. I would stand a little differently in the hallway mirror, not to become someone else but to see whether gentleness could be practiced through posture. I would help with laundry and linger over fabric. Cotton, satin, wool, denim, it all seemed to belong to a language the men around me had been trained to ignore. I could not name what I felt, only that attention itself brought relief. In a louder household, I might have become rebellious. In mine, I became hidden. I learned to build a private self the way some people build a shelter from scraps. A thought here, a mannerism there, a preference softened at the edges so it would not attract ridicule. I did not yet cross-dress, not in the visible sense. But I was already crossing inwardly, stepping away from the hard outline the world kept drawing around me and moving, slowly, towards something quieter and more breathable. What I lacked was language. The absence of language can make even innocent feelings seem dangerous. I did not know whether what comforted me was weakness, strangeness, or some flaw that would grow if noticed. So, I hid it the way children hide bruises they cannot explain, carefully, instinctively, without even deciding to. Adolescence made everything sharper. The demands of masculinity grew louder, just as my interior life grew more delicate. I was told to be confident, decisive, rougher at the edges. I was encouraged to take up space. But taking up space felt like wearing shoes that never fit. I could do it for a few hours at school, at family gatherings, in public places where boys measured one another by noise and certainty. Then I would come home exhausted, not because I had worked hard, but because I had been translating myself all day. That exhaustion became familiar. So did the shame that followed it. I used to think my private longing was shallow because it moved toward visible things, fabric, grooming, softness, grace. But memory has taught me otherwise. What I wanted was not glamour. It was permission. Permission to stop bracing. Permission to stop speaking to myself in the same strict voice I heard from the world. Permission to believe that tenderness was not something shameful in me just because it had been named feminine elsewhere. Years later, I would call this way of living my gentle transformation mindset. But back then it was only instinct. It was only a small inner movement toward survival. Not escape. Not fantasy. Survival. Because when a child learns that parts of the self are unacceptable, the first response is rarely rebellion. More often it is refinement. You do not destroy yourself. You edit yourself. You trim your words. You flatten your gestures. You build a socially acceptable version for daylight and save the more truthful one for the quiet. That quiet became my first real home. I did not know then how long I would live there or how much of my adult life would be spent returning to that hidden room inside myself. I only knew that when the house was asleep and the pressure of being observed was finally gone, I could breathe differently. Not freely, not yet, but differently enough to feel hope. And sometimes, at that age, hope is simply the discovery that another way of being might exist, even if you have to meet it alone in the dark. My 20s did not arrive with liberation. They arrived with structure. School ended, work began, and the adult world rewarded exactly the traits that had worn me down as a boy. Reliability, restraint, endurance. I had all of them. People called me steady, responsible, calm under pressure. What they did not see was that calmness, in my case, had been rehearsed so often it was almost a reflex. I could carry stress beautifully. I could carry disappointment so gracefully that even I stopped noticing its weight until I was alone. I married young, not impulsively, but earnestly. I believed in companionship. I believed in building a life with another person and becoming, through loyalty and effort, the sort of partner who made the world feel safer. My wife was a good woman in many of the ways that matter most. Intelligent, hardworking, honest. We were not a dramatic couple. We built a modest life with bills, routines, family visits, and ordinary fatigue. If there was love missing, it was not because either of us was cruel. It was because I had already spent so many years being edited that even tenderness from another person sometimes reached only the surface of me. Marriage, for a while, made me try harder to be the man I thought would keep everything stable. I worked longer hours. I became more efficient. I let my personality narrow into usefulness. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes from being appreciated mainly for what you can endure. You become a structure in other people's lives. Dependable, necessary, often praised. But structures are not always held. They are stood upon. By then, my private self-expression had taken clearer form, though still in secrecy. It did not begin with dramatic outfits or stolen moments of performance. It began with care rituals that no one thought to question. Better skincare. A longer shower after difficult days. Separating clothes by texture when I folded laundry. Learning that a room can change your breathing if it is arranged gently enough. Buying softer sleepwear under the excuse of comfort. Keeping my nails neat not out of vanity, but because the act itself felt like an apology and a promise at once. The first time I wore something unmistakably feminine in private, the moment was quieter than anyone would imagine. No thunder, no thrill of scandal. Just relief, so deep it made me sit down. I remember the fabric first, then the stillness, then the strange grief that followed. Because relief can expose a wound more clearly than pain ever does. I did not feel transformed into a different person. I felt recognized by myself. That was both beautiful and devastating. Beautiful because it answered a question I had carried for years without words. Devastating because it showed me how long I had been starving emotionally. I had not known how much energy it took to deny myself small forms of comfort until I finally stopped denying them for an evening. After that, the private rituals expanded carefully, almost professionally. I was still cautious, still practical, still terrified of becoming careless with a truth that felt both precious and fragile. I did not throw away my life to pursue another one. That is not how it happened. Instead, I built a parallel ethics of self-treatment. If the world expected hardness from me, then in private I would become deliberate about softness. If daily life required performance, then I would answer with routine. If loneliness hollowed me out, then I would line that hollow place with care. That was the early shape of the gentle transformation mindset, though I had not yet named it. It meant that femininity, for me, was never merely appearance. Appearance mattered, yes, but only because behavior gave it meaning. A blouse on a hanger could not save me. A polished nail could not save me. What helped was the discipline of gentleness. Sitting down with a cup of tea instead of pacing the kitchen in dread, moisturizing my hands as if they belonged to someone worthy of preservation, speaking to myself without contempt, slowing my movements enough to inhabit them. That was the secret core of it. I was not trying to become theatrical. I was trying to become livable. The outside world, meanwhile, only intensified. Careers grow by asking for more than they return. Families do the same. There were holidays that felt like endurance contests, office conversations that left me strangely absent, social expectations that pressed masculinity into every available corner of life. Drink more. Laugh louder. Care less. Be easy to explain. I did not know how to do those things without leaving myself behind, so I became more polished instead. More functional. More admired from a distance. Inside, I began keeping memories like evidence. Not of clothing, but of feelings. The first evening I slept peacefully after letting myself dress, as I wished in private. The first time I looked in the mirror and did not judge what I saw, only accepted it. The first time I realized I was treating my own emotions with the same patience I had always offered others. That patience changed me more than any visible transformation ever could. I became quieter, but not smaller. More precise. More protective of my interior life. I stopped chasing the fantasy that one dramatic decision would solve the ache I had carried since childhood. Instead, I turned toward maintenance, emotional hygiene, small corrections, gentle habits repeated until they became a kind of shelter. This is the truth I wish more people understood. Private self-expression is not always a rebellion against society. Sometimes it is first aid. I was not dressing to mock womanhood, nor to invade it, nor to borrow glamour from it. I was reaching for a vocabulary of care that my masculine training had denied me. I was learning that softness could be practiced, that grace could be chosen, that loneliness becomes more survivable when the self is not treated like an enemy. Still, secrecy has a cost. Even the kindest rituals become heavy when they must remain hidden. There were nights I folded everything away with the same sadness one feels after finishing a conversation with the only person who truly listened. There were mornings I put on my public face so efficiently that it frightened me. I wondered whether I was becoming divided beyond repair. But memory now tells me something kinder. I was not dividing. I was preserving. What looked like contradiction from the outside was, for me, continuity under pressure. A long attempt to stay emotionally alive in an environment that rewarded numbness. I did not yet know where that path would lead. I only knew that each gentle habit made the next day more bearable, and sometimes that is how a life changes. Not with revelation, but with repetition. If my early adulthood taught me how to survive, my middle years taught me how expensive survival can become when it is hidden. By then I was practiced enough to move between selves without obvious friction. At work, I was organized, helpful, dryly funny, the kind of person who remembered deadlines and carried extra responsibilities without complaint. At home, I was useful in all the quiet domestic ways people notice only when they disappear. I grocery shopped carefully. I kept track of appointments. I noticed when soap was running low, when a shirt needed mending, when someone was tired before they admitted it. Care had become my native language, though I still often spoke it through masculine camouflage. The irony never left me. The qualities people praised in me most were the same ones tied, in my private mind, to the feminine self I kept hidden. I had started calling my practice gentle transformation by then, usually in my journal, sometimes only in thought. The phrase made me smile because it gave dignity to what others might have dismissed as weakness or eccentricity. It reminded me that I was not simply dressing differently in private. I was re-educating my nervous system. I was choosing a way of moving through the world that did less violence to my spirit. That sounds dramatic now, but daily life can bruise a person without spectacle. There is the pressure of being the stable one. The pressure of not burdening others with feelings they do not know how to hold. The pressure of being legible. Even love, when filtered through expectation, can become a kind of pressure. My wife knew I was more inward than most men she had met. She knew I carried stress quietly. She knew I needed solitude now and then. But she did not know the full architecture of that solitude. I do not say this to accuse her. Silence was my craft long before it became our habit. Then came my mother-in-law's remark. I wish I could tell you it happened during some dramatic confrontation, but it arrived the way many cruel things do, half casually, almost lazily, in a conversation that had already drifted too far into criticism disguised as concern. She was a woman who believed life should be arranged in visible categories. Men were men, women were women, strength was stern, softness was decorative, and dignity came from staying in the lane assigned to you. She had a talent for reducing complex people into simple disappointments. She had noticed something, though to this day I cannot say exactly what. Perhaps a softness in my grooming that had become harder to hide. Perhaps a private item found and explained away too quickly. Perhaps only the atmosphere around me, because some people can sense when another person is living with an unnamed truth. Whatever it was, she looked at me with that blend of pity and superiority some people mistake for wisdom and said, "You can play at whatever you like in private, but you'll never be a real woman." There are sentences that wound because they reveal hatred. And there are sentences that wound because they try to name your longing before you have named it for yourself. What hurt was not that she had denied me access to womanhood. I had never believed she had the authority to grant it. What hurt was the contempt underneath the statement, the assumption that whatever tenderness I was reaching for must be false because it emerged from me. That my need for gentleness was imitation. That my private acts of care were costume, not survival. I did not argue. People imagine silence is always surrender. Often it is tria. That night I returned home feeling less angry than hollow. I stood in the bathroom after everyone had gone to sleep and looked at my face for a long time. Not to inspect it, but to ask it a question. What have you been trying to become all these years? The answer that came was simple enough to change my life. Not a woman in the way she meant. Not a counterfeit version of anyone. Not a spectacle, not a lie, not even an escape. I had been trying to become safe to myself. That realization did not solve everything, but it rearranged the suffering. It moved shame out of the center. It allowed me to see that my private rituals were not proof of fraudulence. They were evidence of need. Deep, sustained emotional need. The kind created when a person spends decades overperforming a role that keeps everyone else comfortable while quietly starving the soul inside it. After that, my routines changed again, subtly but decisively. I stopped treating private femininity like a guilty indulgence and began treating it like emotional care. I made time for it rather than stealing time for it. I became more thoughtful about what I wore in private, not more extravagant, just more aligned. Clothing that made my breathing easier. Fabrics that encouraged stillness. Colors that softened the room around me. I took better care of my skin, my posture, my sleep. I learned how much panic can be interrupted by something as ordinary as brushing your hair slowly, or choosing a clean nightgown instead of collapsing into bed feeling like a burden in your own body. Routine became revelation. I noticed that when I moved gently, I thought more clearly. When I treated my body with patience, my anger diminished. When I allowed femininity to exist as an ethic rather than only an image, I became kinder even in my public life. Less brittle, less resentful, more able to listen without vanishing. None of this was visible enough to satisfy people who demand obvious narratives. There was no announcement, no scandal, no reinvention montage. Just 1,000 small behavioral changes, repeated until they formed a bridge between the self I showed and the self I protected. But hidden transformation is still transformation. And memory, when it is honest, does not always point to major events. Sometimes it points to the night you stopped mocking your own reflection. The morning you realized that folding your clothes carefully was not silly, but soothing. The week you discovered that loneliness became less poisonous when met with ritual instead of denial. The season of your life when you finally understood that self-expression, at its healthiest, is not self-indulgence. It is self-respect. My mother-in-law's sentence stayed with me, but it began losing authority the moment I stopped taking it as a verdict and started taking it as a mirror of her limitations. She could only imagine identity as something externally certified, socially approved, rigidly defined. But my experience had taught me something quieter and truer. The deepest transformations are often invisible to those who do not practice inner listening. And I, after years of pressure, had become an excellent listener. The body always keeps score, even when the mind insists it can keep going. By the time the test results entered the story, I had already spent years outrunning myself through competence. I was tired in layers. Work tired. Marriage tired. Family tired. The special exhaustion that comes from being reliable to everyone except your own nervous system. I slept, but not deeply. I ate, but often without appetite. I moved through days with the polished efficiency of someone who had confused functioning with wellness. At first I explained everything away. Stress. Age. A busy season. Too much coffee. Not enough rest. But then came the small alarms that do not look dramatic from the outside. Headaches that lingered, a racing pulse for no clear reason, the feeling that my chest was trying to finish a sentence before my mind had started it. My doctor was calm, professional, unsurprised. She ordered tests with the routine kindness of someone who has seen what long-term strain does to people who are praised for coping too well. Waiting for results did something unexpected to me. It slowed me down. For the first time in years, I stopped acting as though endurance alone would answer every question. I came home from that appointment, changed into the clothes that made me feel most at ease, washed my face, tied back my hair, and sat in silence long enough to hear what my life had been saying beneath all the noise. Not what others expected, not what appearances suggested, what my life itself had been saying. It said, "You cannot build peace from self-erasure." I thought about all the phases of my life then, not as isolated chapters, but as one long lesson in adaptation. The child who learned to become manageable, the young man who became dependable, the husband who became useful, the adult who made private tenderness into a quiet life raft. None of these selves had been false. They had simply been incomplete under pressure. The gentle transformation mindset had begun as refuge, but by then it had matured into philosophy. It meant choosing self-respect over self-correction. It meant understanding that femininity, for me, was not something I performed to impress or provoke. It was a language through which I could finally offer myself care without embarrassment. It was how I interrupted the old internal command to toughen up, move faster, feel less, need nothing. So while I waited for those results, I paid attention not to appearance, but to behavior. I cooked proper meals and ate them sitting down. I opened windows in the morning instead of stumbling straight into obligation. I changed the sheets, lit a candle, and let my room feel like a place a gentle person might inhabit on purpose. I stopped rushing through the mirror as if my own reflection were an administrative task. I moisturized my hands, massaged my temples, brushed fabric smooth over my knees, and allowed small routines to do what no speech had ever managed, convince me I was worth tending to. The results arrived on a gray afternoon. I opened the portal with the familiar dread of modern adulthood, half expecting catastrophe, half expecting nothing at all. What I found was neither. My numbers were not disastrous, but they were not neutral. Stress markers elevated. Blood pressure higher than it should be. Sleep disruption evident in the patterns we had discussed. The clinical language was restrained, but the message beneath it was plain enough. My body had been living in a state of quiet alarm for too long. I stared at that screen for a while, and to my own surprise, I cried. Not because I was frightened, though there was fear. Not because the results were dramatic, though they were serious enough to matter. I cried because the paper said, in the impersonal grammar of medicine, what I had spent years trying to tell myself in private: this way of living is costing you. And suddenly my mother-in-law's sentence returned to me, stripped of its poison. You'll never be a real woman. What an impoverished understanding of reality, I thought. Because what my life had taught me was that realness is not granted by spectators. It is built through alignment, through honesty, through the daily refusal to abandon oneself for the sake of being easier to categorize. If womanhood, in my case, existed anywhere at all, it existed in the sacred domestic intelligence I had spent years cultivating, the instinct to soothe rather than punish, to beautify rather than brutalize, to care for the body as a lived home rather than a machine under management. The test results did not make me into anyone new. They did something more valuable. They removed my last excuse to continue living against myself. After that day, my changes were still gentle, still behavioral, still private in many ways, but they were no longer apologetic. I protected my sleep with the seriousness of a person protecting a future. I declined obligations that demanded emotional self-neglect. I became more honest in small conversations, less eager to laugh off what actually mattered. I dressed in ways that comforted me when I was alone, and allowed that comfort to count as real rather than provisional. I treated softness not as an indulgence after life was done, but as part of how life should be lived. That is the thing nobody tells you about survival. Eventually, if you are lucky, survival asks to become a life. And when it does, the habits that once saved you quietly begin teaching you how to stay. Peace did not arrive all at once. It arrived the way dawn arrives in winter, slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the world needed to be convinced that light was still worth offering. But once it began, I recognized it immediately because it did not feel like excitement. It felt like permission. Not permission from family. Not permission from marriage. Not permission from society, medicine, or anyone with a theory about what I should be. Permission from myself. In the months after the test results, I began looking back over my life with less judgment and more compassion. Memory changed shape when I stopped using it as evidence against myself. I could see now that every phase had contained the same longing in different clothing. As a child, I wanted quiet. As a young adult, I wanted relief. As a husband under pressure, I wanted a way to remain emotionally alive. And in all those years, what I called cross-dressing from the outside had really been something deeper from the inside, a disciplined return to tenderness. That is why the gentle transformation mindset became so important to me. It freed me from the need to dramatize myself in order to understand myself. I no longer asked, "What am I allowed to call this?" before I asked, "Is this helping me live with more honesty and less pain?" That question changed everything. Because yes, I still cared about clothing. I still loved the private grace of fabrics chosen with intention, the quiet ritual of getting ready for no audience, the dignity of seeing myself reflected in a way that softened old internal battles. But I stopped mistaking the symbols for the source. The source was care. The source was the gradual replacement of contempt with attention. I learned to speak to myself differently. That alone felt revolutionary. No more sneering at my needs before anyone else could. No more acting as though the parts of me that sought softness were childish, fraudulent, or embarrassing. No more assuming that pain had to become catastrophic before it deserved response. I became, in middle age, the kind of guardian for myself I had once needed as a child. There is a mature kind of femininity in that, whether or not the world approves of the label. Not a performance. Not an imitation. A practice. A steadiness. A cultivated refusal to answer cruelty with more cruelty, especially toward oneself. My relationship with my wife changed too, though not in some miraculous, cinematic way. We became more honest in increments. I stopped offering such polished versions of myself all the time. I let some fatigue be visible. I admitted, in language she could hear, that I had been lonelier than I knew how to say. Not every truth was easy. Not every silence disappeared. But even partial honesty brought oxygen into rooms that had long felt sealed. As for my mother-in-law, I stopped carrying her sentence around like a nail in my pocket. Some people never learn to recognize forms of truth that do not flatter their worldview. That is their poverty, not mine. I no longer needed to defeat her opinion because I no longer treated it as a test I had failed. The real test had been quieter. Could I build a life in which my inner world and outer behavior were not enemies? Could I live in my body without relating to it only through duty? Could I practice self-expression without shame and self-care without apology? Could I become, at last, safe to myself? The answer did not arrive in a speech. It arrived in mornings, in fresh sheets and steady breathing, in tea cooling beside a notebook, in the small confidence of choosing what to wear at home and knowing that choice mattered because I mattered, in the way my shoulders no longer rose toward my ears every evening, in the way loneliness, while not vanished, stopped feeling like exile. I had made companionship with myself. That is no small thing. Looking back now, I understand that I never needed a dramatic event to transform me. Life had already done enough to shape me through pressure. What saved me was not a single act of reinvention, but 1,000 acts of gentleness repeated until they formed a path. That path led me here. I am older now, and in many ways simpler. I no longer chase impossible approval. I no longer measure authenticity by how legible it appears to others. I no longer confuse emotional numbness with strength. If I dress softly in private, I do so with gratitude, not secrecy in the old wounded sense. If I move through the day with care, I do so because care is not decorative. It is structural. It holds a life together. And when I think of those test results now, I do not think of fear first. I think of clarity. They arrived, and with them came the final proof that I had been asking the wrong people for permission. My body had already testified. My memories had already testified. My routines, my loneliness, my quiet acts of self-preservation, they had all been telling the same story for years. So here's the truth I finally live by. I do not need to win an argument about whether I am real by someone else's definition. Reality is the peace I feel when I stop fighting my own softness. Reality is the calm that comes when my behavior reflects my inner life instead of denying it. Reality is the home I built inside myself, one gentle decision at a time. And in that home, at last, there is no mockery, no performance, no panic, only emotional clarity, only care, only the deep and ordinary peace of becoming someone I can live with and someone I no longer need to hide from.